Hey guys, it's Ethan from Zimmer Labs, and this is a Roman Props Luke V2 that I just finished up for Mike. This came out really well. I'm pretty happy with it. I'll take you guys through it in a second, but basically Mike had bought most of the parts ahead of time, but bought the chassis for an MK1 because it's essentially compatible, but it isn't actually meant to go in this saber, so it wasn't quite compatible, so we had to make it work, but it came out great. But he didn't know that because he's new to the saber game, so he sent me all the stuff, and at first I didn't think it was going to work at all, but after getting it and taking a peek, it really did seem like it was close. So I'll show you what we did, how we made it work, and what's going on. But the idea here was that Mike wanted the lightsaber to look as if it was built from parts that had been kind of lost and buried in the desert for a couple hundred years before being salvaged or reclaimed and assembled into a shiny new lightsaber. So that's the theme that we're going for here in the motif. Let's start by, I'll show you guys how everything is built and how we assemble. Like I said, it's an MK1 stock Custom Works chassis with a Rudy Pando crystal chamber. Like I usually do, I machined out this section inside here to fit a 28mm JBL speaker, which sits flush right in there, and there's about 3.5mm between the speaker and the battery. Hopefully you guys can see that, which is just enough for the speaker to be able to move freely without contacting the battery, so you don't get any issues with sound distortion or anything like that. Then the battery is an 18650, and if you're very, very careful and very sparing with how you wire it, and if you sand down the base of the chassis section that holds the soundboard, and actually if you sand down the top front end or the rear end of the chassis itself too, and you do it all carefully so you can't tell it's been done, you can fit all this stuff into this chassis, even though the chassis is designed for 18500 and a flat speaker. So that's one nice thing. The way this guy works is you've got two covers that are on clamps, clips, whatever you want to call it, which clip onto some 2mm brass rods or steel rods or aluminum rods, whatever you want to use. And then there's a section here of the chassis, section here of the chassis that are connected by those rods. This section holds the soundboard, which in this case is a Proffieboard V2, and this is the end that sticks out of the pommel where you get your main kill switch access, your USB, SD card, and recharge access, all right there. And then, like I said, the battery basically takes up all the rest of the chassis, and it comes right up to where the soundboard begins. So this bottom section on the bottom side of the soundboard is where you want to sand. Take about at least 1 millimeter of material away to save yourself an extra millimeter of room. That's critical if you want to fit everything in here. And then you just have to be careful to be extra clean in running your wires. You can get all your wires, only have one wire going on this side, and everything else is running up this side. And there are only 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. There's only 5 wires going through the middle section of the saber here, and they just pass right under the header pin section and alongside the speaker. So if you minimize wiring and you do everything as carefully and cleanly as you can squeeze all this stuff in here, and it will fit It will work correctly. And that's key because, you know, you don't want to have a wimpy speaker in your lightsaber. You just don't. And you don't want to have a wimpy battery. Because it's going to detract from the overall quality and, you know, the feel of how it all works. Now, up top we've got, like I said, this is the Rudy Pando crystal chamber. Well, crystal chamber chassis. And then got stock custom works, crystal chamber inserts printed. Mike had these printed in, I think it was a polished bronzed stainless steel, or maybe it was a polished silver bronze stainless steel or something like that. But these two parts essentially were very, you know, very much gritty looking, flat, matte texture, matte finished without any shine, and basically looked like they were made of, you know, kind of like a rusted metal that was a sand color. So they took a fair amount of refinishing to get them to have that shine and that look. And it's a real hassle because there's so many different angles and surfaces to work with on these two pieces that you don't want to sand these or try to refinish these if you can avoid it. Just because you're going to spend like days trying to get there. And I mean, I'm happy with these, but I could still spend another day sanding and, you know, shining these up even more. But you know, there comes a point where you have to just call it and say, you know, I'm not gonna work on these forever. I'm happy with how they look now, and next time I'm gonna print them in something else. But the idea here is, like I said, parts lost and buried in a desert for a couple hundred years. So it actually works really well for the motif, because that's kind of what you've got here as far as the internal components go. They look like they're pretty worn, while at the same time not being broken and old. You know, worn but still essentially unused and ready to go. And then I did just, you know, a whole bunch of different custom, you know, cutting and adding of different elements. This is a flux capacitor style crystal chamber, one of my favorite motifs to use. Typically with the Rudy Pando chamber, you get, this comes with some intermediate sized brass things that just kind of stick up from the bottom and down from the top. You get 3 of them. There's 1, 2, 3, and they, actually I'll grab them so you can see. So here's a couple of them. Basically, when you get the RP chamber, there's 3 of these brass rods that have, you know, 3 different sections of different widths that are just kind of sticking up out of 2 holes here and down out of 1 hole here. So it just kind of looks like that. And that, you know, that's cool. It's a nice little extra touch that Rudy gives you when you get this crystal chamber, but I've always felt that they were kind of pointless, and, you know, they don't really look like anything. They don't seem like they're doing anything. They're just kind of stubby brass things. So I like to do something different with those spots. So the 3 holes where those I pulled out of, what I did was I took them, cut them off, and milled them out so that they were hollow and would take some, you know, corrugated tubing here, and then I just set them at different depths, polished them up, and installed some different sections of tubing going to different parts of the crystal chamber and into the chassis. Like for instance, this one up top here is essentially pumping something. It's either pumping coolant or maybe siphoning off the power of the crystal itself. As you can see, the corrugated tubing goes right into the crystal chamber generator area. So that's kind of cool because it just ties things together, and you know, it gives it a more realistic look and a more, you know, it seems like there's more useful stuff going on inside here. On the back side, what you get is, generally when you get this guy, there are just two brass pipes that run across here, and those are intended to be your wire channels to get wires from this side to this side. But if you only, like I said, if you only use a minimal amount of wires to accomplish what you need, then you only need one of these tubes to pass wires from this side to this side, which opens up this section to more fun stuff like this heavy-duty cooling reservoir system that I've got installed here. So the idea here is, got this, essentially it's a three-way header pipe situation going on here that's pumping off and siphoning off coolant throughout the entire crystal chamber chassis, and that's done again with some of the corrugated tubing and using the holes that were already in the chassis, pre-drilled holes, one here that other tube would have used, and then an additional hole that that I added, which is very simple. Anyone can do that with if you take your time and just, if you have a decent drill or if you have a drill press or something like that, just add an extra hole here, add a couple holes here for this guy, and then add a hole into this crystal chamber part for this tube. That's pretty much all you have to do to accomplish this design. But it looks nice, it's detailed, it's shiny, it's fun, it looks semi-realistic, and it isn't something that you have to spend a whole bunch of money on to accomplish, because these are just threaded rods, or you could even use long screws, and this is just brass piping, brass tubing. So instead of spending $100 a piece on crystal chamber inserts, or the Proplicator fins that are going to cost you $75 to $100, you can do this for $1. It takes a lot more time, but if you're willing to put the time in, spend some time doing it and get creative, for $1 you can get a really good look that you would otherwise have to spend $75 to $100 at least to accomplish if you're going to buy printed parts or other parts. Not that I'm knocking the Proplicator fins, they're awesome, I love those. I've used those in many sabers, but I like to try to, every saber I build, I like to try to do it a little differently than the last one, just to keep it new and keep the ideas coming. As far as the overall finish of the RP chassis, those of you guys familiar with it will know that this is not what it really looks like when you get it, and this finish here is just a nice matte, simple matte finish on the entire aluminum face here, and that's just accomplished by sandpaper, 220 grit, and then 400, and then I do 800 over the top, and just go around in a circular clockwise motion to sand. If you go up and down and around, it doesn't look very good, but if you go one direction the entire time, you get a nice finished look that looks like maybe polished stainless steel or brushed aluminum, something like that. And then some acid in all the grooves here to give it some color and depth, some contrast, which it just looks good. And then the flat facing inside parts of the crystal chamber itself, you want to sand those down as well with the 220 and 400 and 800, just because there are a lot of tooling and machining marks on these parts. There's swirls left from the elements that were used to cut this section out, and that just doesn't look very good. They're not terrible. It's not like you have to sand the section down, but if you do, it just looks that much better, that much nicer, that much more finished, that much more premium if this is nice and finished on the inside here and no cutting marks or anything like that. The next thing to do that I like to do is I like to put screws in these 4 holes here, because as you guys will see, those screws are going to be visible through these holes in the Graflex clamp. And so all four of those are going to have these nice brass screws visible through there. They're actually functional because they do hold these two sections together. I also like to drill and then tap and thread another hole here and put another hex or Allen wrench screw there, and then drill and tap this guy all the way through. So there are 4 screws holding this section together, which is nice because this is really, you know, totally rock solid, whereas with the way it comes, you just get 1 screw and it's only tapped and threaded through the first half, and it's just putting a little pressure onto this piece, and that's all that's holding it together. And it's enough. It really is enough, but it's not, you know, it's not, I wouldn't call it super secure. It's something that, you know, over time might wear out. Then the last thing I like to do as far as modifying this Rudy Pando chassis is adding a bit of brass hexagonal mesh here and carving out this section right there. I use a Dremel and then a file or some sandpaper to smooth it out. But the idea here is to create a sound vent that is going to line up with this hole in the Graflex clamp, because that's where your speaker is. So there's not a lot of area for the sound to come out of this clamp, but this is a good hole right here, a great sound vent right there. But that's going to be blocked up by this aluminum the way it is. So if you carve it out a bit, then you get a nice, like, slanted, angled vent that goes right into the speaker, so you get a lot more sound coming out of here. But for looks, you know, you add a little bit of hexagonal brass mesh, try saying that twice, and then you see that through the hole, but you get the nice sound venting with some good looks too. And then, you know, attaching this, mounting this part is just, that's simple. What I like to do is just a couple of really small, I think they're 1mm M1 screws. Like they're M1.2 by 3mm Phillips heads. And so all you have to do is tap and thread a very small hole right there, and then a very small hole right there on the inside going down, and then you can create this mesh piece, bend it up so it's the right shape and size. You can set it in there, and then you can just screw it in and down, and then it's not going anywhere. Nice, firm, solid, almost structural at this point. Looks good, looks like it's supposed to be there, and it's going to give you a nice finished look on the saber when you finally put it together. So that is the internals, and as you can see, it's fully modular, fully removable, which is nice because that makes life easier for repairs, upgrades, customizations in the future, and it adds to the fun factor of playing with it. Because let's face it, I know these are toys, and I know that we're grown-ups and all that stuff, but yeah, I still like playing with them, I'm not gonna lie. And so anytime you can make the fun factor better, more, anytime you can add to the fun factor, why not, right? So let's put this guy together. And the way to do that is we start with the clamp, Graflex clamp here, and you just want to make sure that you are lining it up in the correct direction and in the correct way with the correct little, you know, bits. And you know you've got it when you see those brass screws I mentioned through these holes, and you see that brass mesh through this hole, and then the 2 screws through this hole. So that right there is perfect. And then you can also insert the button apparatus and if you line it up correctly, it will just pop right in there. Press that in, go ahead and put the clamp card in. And we can lock that down. And we'll put the pommel on, and all you have to do is slide it on and then screw it down. then the front end. And the front end is held on just by one hex screw right here. So I'm going to loosen that a bit. And now this guy is actually part of the Rudy Pando chassis. Alright, so this piece is the part that slides on this chassis. But when I'm taking it apart, I like to leave this installed into the front end of the hilt itself and just loosen and tighten that screw to take everything off. So all you have to do is slide it on, tighten that screw, and you're good to go. Now, what I spent a lot of time on this one with was trying to come up with the system to make this a modular chassis and allow this section to be removable. And that was tricky because, unlike the MK1, the front end of this hilt is only two pieces. The MK1, the grenade section separates from the wind vane section, which separates from the emitter. On this guy, the emitter, I'm not going to unscrew it, but the emitter unscrews right there, and that's it. This piece is all one big machined piece, which means you can't, well, you probably could, but it's not going to be easy to mount a pogo pin connector right here on the inside of this. And that means you also can't mount a pogo pin style connector here to make that connection, which you do on an MK1, which is simple. It's very, very easy to do, very easy to install. But when you're working at that distance, getting it in there and mounting it and all that good stuff, it's considerably more difficult. So you have to have wiring running down to here to meet this connector. And what I initially did was I just used round header pins, which are like, really, they're the perfect jack of all trades kind of connection medium. You know, you can use them for so many things, but they're delicate, you know? They're not the kind of thing that are gonna withstand, and when I say header pins, I mean these. It's not the kind of thing that's gonna withstand being taken off and reinstalled 1,000 times. These little tiny pins right here, these guys are really easy to bend, and after you've bent them a few times, you know, 5 or 10 times, they're gonna break off. So while they're really good for making connections because they fit just about anywhere, they're a little bit too delicate, but they also are a bit limited in that they're not really intended to carry all that much current. And when you're talking about a Neopixel blade lightsaber, there is a fair amount of current passing through. So if you're going to use header pins, you're going to want to double up on the header pins that carry the power and the ground current. The data line is fine to use just one because that's not carrying much of anything, but the actual electrical current that's powering and running the LEDs, the pixels, is carrying a fair amount of current. So one header pin, 2 header pins is not really going to be enough. I mean, it'll work, but it, you know, over time they may melt, they may fail. You know, it's not the kind of thing that's really going to be guaranteed to last or be sufficient. So what I ended up doing was a magnetic connector system with pogo pins. And this guy I actually built from just straight from scratch. I got 2 oval magnets. I built some plastic inserts and then drilled 3 holes through them on both sides, and then I literally installed 3 pogo pins into this side and 3 female pogo pin mates into this side. So these are not connectors you guys can buy anywhere. These are straight up homemade, but they work great, and because they're magnetic, like, you don't even have to connect them, they connect themselves. And as you can see, it's very, very simple to detach them. Just kind of pull on them and they just come apart. But all you have to do is make sure you're lining up the polarity, so keep the red side and the red side in the same ballpark, put them close, and then, you know, just kind of move them around until they're seated. You know, if it's not straight, then it's not quite seated, but as long as it's straight, then you know you're good. And as you can see here on this side, there's an aluminum housing around everything for this magnet to sit into, to make it more stable, and so you can tell when it is connected and lined up. And now we just want to make sure that everything is perfectly lined up. There we go. You don't want to put any real force on them either. Like, if you've got them lined up, it'll just slide in. And if you don't, then it won't. And you don't want to force it in, right? Right. Okay. Screw the emitter on, or put the clamp card on. Oh, actually, before we get there, one last thing to show you guys. To get these buttons just right, you have to take some material off both sides. As you can see, hopefully you can see here, the middle is about 1 millimeter wide, and then the sides are about 0.5 millimeter. So I took about 0.5 millimeter of silicon off of here and here, just because that that gives it the ability to bend a little bit more and be more springy, but B, it will give the clamp card more room to move up and down inside the clamp little, the clamp area, the little side of the metal bars that hold the clamp in place, the grooved section. Hopefully you guys can see the actual space in there. But if you remove a little bit of that material, there's more room for the clamp card to move. Whereas if you don't, the clamp card takes up almost the whole space, so there really isn't any room for it to go up and down. But if you don't take any material from the middle, then if you use a tiny bit of double-sided tape there to aid in, it staying put, you get a little bit of pressure on the switch apparatus, which keeps the clamp card from moving around freely on you, which is good because you don't want it coming out or moving around, while at the same time giving you functional buttons. And as you guys can hear, really good action on those. And that's important for a couple reasons. Mainly because with tactile switches, you want to have some actual tactile response, so consciously that you're actually pressing the button. You're not just guessing and then looking at the lightsaber to see if it's doing what you expect it to do. Just having that little feel of the click and being able to actually hear it as well, that probably consciously and subconsciously is something that your brain interprets as the switch is working, and it's working, and it just makes it that much easier to use the lightsaber and enjoy it when you have that feedback response. So let's see. Might as well at this point. Well, before we do, let's move on to the finish. So when I received this guy, this was just I think it was just a plain, unfinished, machine finished steel hilt that Mike bought, and then Mike cleaned it, I believe, and applied gun blue to the whole thing. So the entire hilt itself looked like this darkest section right here of this part. So the whole thing was a very uniform dark blue-gray, and it looked good, but it didn't look weathered. And the other problem was that when I say it all looked like it all looked like it except for the aluminum parts, which is the pommel, the mystery chunk, and the pointy greeble here, and also the Graflex clamp. This was essentially still pristine because Graflex clamps don't change with gun blue. It's not, the finish and coatings that are on here aren't affected by gun blue, and also aluminum is not either. So in order to get this look, what we had to do was a bunch of acid baths for the aluminum. So this was a triple acid wash for all the aluminum parts, and then just some light buffing with some. I think it was some 000 steel wool, and then some brass wool. And I'll tell you guys about brass wool in a second, but that's how you get this grunge in the cracks look. All the parts that are kind of sticking out the most are the parts where it would come into contact the most if you're using it, and as a result, they're the parts that are the cleanest, and all the cracks and grooves are the parts where the grunge is still built up. So that's kind of the effect you try to get when you're doing this type of weathering. And then obviously the same for this mystery chunk and the spiky greeble, with, you know, a lot of the knurled section here still has caked on weathering junk inside of it, and the same with the top knurled section here. And that's just because, you know, in real life, if you had a used beat up, you know, lightsaber or tool or something like that that had these things, that's where the stuff, the grease, the junk, the grime would cake up. The Graflex clamp was a challenge. To get this look, I had to sand it down, and what I did was I used 220 grit sanding wheels, the Dremel kind. They're like abrasive buffs, and you just lightly sand the whole face of the Graflex clamp until you can see that the surface is slightly starting to be affected. You don't want to take anything off, really, very little, but just kind of rough up the surface so that it's not, you know, a shiny, perfect, glossy finish anymore. And then a ferric chloride acid bath, and then just, you know, obviously clean it off, rinse it off, wipe it off with alcohol, and then you get that effect. The same with the sidebars, except for I actually had to use some sandpaper because the abrasive buffs just weren't doing it. So you have to sand the sides of these sidebars down a bit to get the acid to really take hold and bite in. But at the end of the day, you know, the whole thing looks consistent, which is really the most important part. If you're trying to do a weathered looking saber, you want it to look unique, consistent, and, you know, kind of universal from head to toe. You don't want it to have parts that are shiny and parts that are dark, parts that are dirty, parts that are clean. You want the whole thing to look either clean or dirty or beat up or fresh, whatever, but you want it to be the same from top to bottom. And so that's basically what we got here. And then to finish it off, what I did was I used brass wool, which is it's just like steel wool, except it's made out of brass, so it's obviously less abrasive. And when you're working on stainless steel, a stainless steel part with brass wool, you're not actually sanding the part with the brass wool, you're actually sanding the brass wool with the part, because this is much harder, stronger metal. So when you do that, what you're doing is you're actually taking a bit of the brass wool and applying it to the part. So this lightsaber was essentially getting a brass coating. And hopefully you guys can see it, but if not, I'll try to explain what I mean here. There is kind of a gold sheen to the whole thing. It's really, really minimal and really light, but, you know, from pretty much every angle, but especially when you hold it up in the light, there's a gold sheen, just a little bit of a gold coloring to the whole thing from top to bottom, and that's not something that was there before. That's something that you get when you do the brass wool. Or you could metal wash, like it's like stone washing, but it's with metal. You could do that. You could do the same thing and get the same effect with metal washing, but it's going to be a lot more abrasive and a lot more destructive to the part you're doing, because that's just a much more destructive process. So using the brass wool is a lot milder and a lot less destructive on the part. So it's easier, it's faster, less work involved, and you also do less damage, take off less, and weather less, but you still get the overall effect of the the kind of burnished look. And that was kind of critical to me because, like I said, Mike wanted this to look like it was you know, an artifact basically found out in the desert after being out there sun beaten and sand beaten for a couple hundred years. So I really wanted it to have that burnished look, and I think we accomplished that. I really do. I think it looks consistent and, you know, beat up, but still at the same time essentially new. Just kind of like somebody had a really nice saber and they lost it in the desert. 200 years later, somebody found it and cleaned it up, but it essentially has never been used. Just beaten on by the sun, the sand, and the wind. And then last thing on the finish is the blade plug. This is not a Roman prop standard blade plug. This is actually a blade plug that I made out of parts from one of these guys. This is a Corbanth LS6. And when you get these, when you buy these empty, you get 2 different emitters with the kit. And one of those emitters has this static top that's like a blade plug, except it's the whole emitter, and this part is, you know, the tip of that. So if you just basically cut that off, then you can sand it down to make it the correct size and install it into a piece of 1-inch blade tube like so. And then all I did was acid wash this to match the rest of the hilt, and that gives us a nice, mostly screen accurate, shine through style blade plug that just, you know, I think it looks pretty good, and it definitely works with the whole motif. Nice shine through on that guy. Nice and bright. And, you know, it's also at the same time not super over the top. Very simple. Get a nice finish on the very front end to give it some tone, to give it some, you know, sophistication. Have it be nice and clean and shiny looking with a nice beveled edge, while at the same time consistent with the weathered appearance on the sides. The retention here is on the side, just like with an MK1. As far as the electronics go, got a stock Custom Works Neopixel onboard connector. Like the MK1, I use the heatsink part as the connector mount. You simply have to cut off the side walls that come straight out that would house an LED, and you do that for a couple reasons. One, so that the part can be used as a blade connector holder, but 2, also so that you can use a 7/8 inch blade with a 1-inch adapter, because this adapter will fit nice right around the edge inside of there in that little extra space, and that holds really snug just like that. But also because of that, you're able to use a 7/8 inch blade, which you otherwise couldn't use, because that heatsink holder basically comes all the way to the top, and it is 7/8 inch round, so you couldn't get a 7/8 inch blade in there. You can only use a 1-inch blade, and I feel like those are a little too big for this lightsaber. To fire this guy up, main switch right there. Crank down the blade really quick. Really good smooth swing font. And I'm pretty sure that was called Rescue by K-Seth, which is a Luke font based on the sound effects from the Mandalorian Season 2 final episode. So that's kind of cool, because it's different from all the Luke Return of the Jedi sound fonts. It's kind of the first time we've ever had a hero-style sound font that's not actually from Return of the Jedi. To reveal the crystal chamber, you just pop the Graflex clamp lever, spring loaded, close the lever, and get the Rudy Pando Stock Custom Works crystal chamber with what I like to call the flux capacitor upgrade. We've got the triple corrugated tubing going on here, pumping power and energy in and out of the crystal and into the blade itself. On the back side, we've got the tubing array that's essentially a cooling system. Once again, pumping different materials and fluids throughout all the different systems of the lightsaber, but mainly what this is doing is it's pumping coolant around out of this main brass tube here. And this is something I like to do because it's cool looking, it's different, it's unique, but it's also inexpensive. You know, you don't have to do anything like this. Typically you just get this brass pipe and then another similar brass pipe on the other side. But you don't need both brass pipes to pass the wires. You really only need one pipe. And just having two brass pipes here is fine, but it's not really all that done up. So a lot of people will get like the Proplicator fins, which look really nice. I've done a lot of those, but at the same time, those are a bit expensive. You know, they're anywhere from $60 to $100, depending on what metal they're made of. And this right here is $1. You know, these parts are it's just brass tube and either threaded rods or long screws. You know, that's all that is. Takes a little patience and a little practice to, you know, get the process down, but it saves a whole bunch of money on parts, and it still looks really good. Certainly looks, I would say, as good as, you know, Proplicator fins or whatever other different part you decide to put back here from Shapeways. But it's just, you know, it's another way to go, another option, and it does save some money. Same with this side. These are same idea, you know, you just add a couple of small extra holes and then get some brass tubing, or use the original brass greeble things that come with the Rudy Pando chamber, cut them off and drill them out, and then you can use them as kind of these tubing holders essentially, you know, just to give it a little bit more detail. And you could, you know, set it up however you like. But I like to take advantage of the pre-drilled holes that are already in the chassis, and then just add a few more, you know, whatever else I need to add to make it work. But if there are already holes there, you might as well use them. And then the other thing you want to do with this, or at least I like to do with this, is I like to acid wash all of the recessed sections here. So these stripes, horizontal stripes in this vertical section here, and then these stripes on this side, just to give it some contrast. You know, when you have everything silver, you don't really notice that they're even there. So if you do a wash inside there, or somehow add some color to the inside, some grime, then they pop out, and it's that much more detail that's obvious. And the other thing to do is this whole piece, this whole section that's the RP crystal chamber chassis, when you get it brand new, it is nice and clean and well made and really well machined, but at the same time it does have tool marks all over it, and they're not terrible, they're not bad, but they're certainly visible. And, you know, subconsciously, to me, they don't look good. It's not like you look at them and go, oh, those don't look good. You look at it, it looks fine, but subconsciously, you know, your brain sees them, they're there, and they shouldn't be, so it detracts from the appearance. So really, you just want to sand all these surfaces down just a little bit, you know. What I like to do is 220 and then 400 and then 800 sandpaper on these two flat surfaces here and here, and then the bottom side here and here, and the same over here, and then just all the way around the whole thing. For 220, 400, and then 800, but I don't do the 800 on the outside. And just mildly, you don't want to change the shape or the width or anything, you just want to clean up any marks that are there. Just smooth it out so the whole thing looks more finished and professional. You know, no tooling marks left, it just looks better. And I would say, for purposes of this build, it ended up being really, you know, the right way to go with it, because the whole thing works together still. Like the inside of this crystal chamber still matches the outside of the hilt as far as the weathering and the finish goes. This otherwise would have looked brand new, where the outside would have looked weathered. And then it's not consistent and it just doesn't quite work together. So this way, I think it still works nice together. That way it all kind of, you know, meshes. And then the only other thing to point out here for you guys is the crystal, which is about 1.5 inches long, about a 1/4 inch wide crystal spear that runs right through the whole thing. It's really nicely illuminated. And that was just a kind of a funky shaped crystal that I had, that I'd been trying to find a way to use, and it fit just really fit perfectly in this saber. So I was really glad to get that one and give it a home. Now let's see, run through the blade presets real quick. I'm just going to reset it so that we're back to the beginning. So the first blade is like a Hasbro Force Effects green. Second blade is a more pale, like Kit Fisto green. With a really good smooth swing font. This might be my favorite all time so far. It's just incredibly accurate as far as the sensitivity. And I think that one is father-son. Don't quote me on it, but I'm pretty sure it is. Next up, we've got just a traditional green. This is a turbine style green.
With the blast shield down, I can't even see. How am I supposed to fight?
Actually, let's jump back. Every blade has its own quotes, and obviously it's a Luke saber, so
You'll find I'm full of surprises.
lots of Luke quotes on this guy.
You'll find I'm full of surprises. You'll find I'm full of surprises. Your overconfidence is your weakness. I feel the conflict within you. Let go of your hate. I'll never turn to the dark side. Greetings, Exalted One. I am a Jedi, like my father before me. What a piece of junk! Well, I was going into Tashi Station to pick up some power converters.
I think I might have at that point been starting to run out of the better Luke quotes. Next blade up is Cyan. Little Tusken Raider.
I am Luke Skywalker, Jedi Knight and friend to Captain Solo. I am Luke Skywalker, Jedi Knight and friend to Captain Jedi Knight and friend to Captain Solo.
Come on, randomizer.
With the blast shield down, I can't even see. How am I supposed to fight? With the blast shield down, I can't even see.
Next up is a audio flicker yellow white blade.
If you strike me down, I shall become more powerful than you can possibly imagine.
Purple blade. Green color cycle blade. Got Chewie and the Tusken Raider on that one. Green fire blade.
Who's the more foolish, the fool or the fool who follows it? Who's the more foolish, the fool or the fool who follows it? Who's the more foolish?
Red fire blade. POV blade.
I am Luke Skywalker, Jedi Knight and friend to Captain Solo.
Oh, that's a replay.
You can't win, Darth. You can't win, Darth.
These aren't the droids you're looking for.
And hold out your hand when you play that one.
You can't win, Darth.
These aren't the droids you're looking for.
You just do that and guaranteed the police will leave you alone. And that's pretty much it for the blade array. I think what else we haven't gone over. I think actually pretty much covers everything. I haven't pointed these out yet. This is the hexagonal brass mesh that I showed you guys earlier, and the cutout where the audio venting section is, so that you get a bit louder sound from this guy from having the speaker inside here. Then the brass flathead screws through all these side holes. You know, just giving it a little bit of added extra detail. Not required, but and then the one other thing, the chassis that I began explaining earlier that we used for this guy was not actually the chassis that's intended for this, and so initially it just didn't fit, and in order to make it fit, we really had to, you know, maximize space, and you know, I had to cut things down and sand things down, etc., etc. If you look inside here, you may be able to see slight milling marks on the inside, and that's because I took 3.5 millimeters out at the very bottom here, so that this would screw all the way on without crushing the chassis. The only kind of point we had to give back, the only way we really had to sacrifice for was this bit right there, that thinnest section around the emitter. That actually, the pommel should actually be abutting this piece right here. So this rib should be touching right there. So just this 3 millimeter section is sticking out where it isn't supposed to, but to me and for my money, like, I'm okay with that. I don't think it's noticeable. I don't think it detracts from the look. It certainly doesn't detract from the way the saber works or handles or feels. And there, to be perfectly honest, there are just so many versions of a Luke hero lightsaber. I mean, I've built probably 15 to 20 different versions of this thing over the years, and they all look different. I mean, every single one of them looks different. I mean, you'd think that they would all kind of look the same, but they really don't. And they all look different right here. You know, like this guy and this guy look really almost nothing alike. So the fact that that section right there is slightly different from this really is just really is not something that stands out to me, because there are so many differences elsewhere that difference isn't noticeable. You know, like this section is a different length and width on this guy. This shiny chrome section here and here doesn't exist on this guy. The, you know, ribbed grenade sections are totally different, completely. The width of these parts, you know, totally change from top to bottom, whereas they stay the same here. Obviously there's a bunch of differences up here on the emitter. There are so many differences, and this is just one example. There's so many ways that this hilt differs depending on who is making it, who the manufacturer was, that little tiny bit just doesn't stand out to me, doesn't check off a box to me that's negative. So I'm really still very happy with it, and having made the chassis fit and work right. So to the extent, Mike, that you aren't cool with that, let me know and we'll figure out something. I mean, I'm sure it's something we can work around. Could probably replace this part with one that was 3 millimeters longer and it would be all set, but that would be kind of a hassle. But the point is, other than that, this guy is able to take the MK1 Stock Custom Works chassis 100% as is, with, you know, minimal modifications, and works great. Nice fit all around. You know, diameter wise it's great, length wise it's great, and it's a really good chassis. You know, chassis that I really enjoy building. I've built a million of them, so I'm glad that we were able to make it work. And yeah, I think that's about it. So let me know what you think, Mike, and of course thank you. And to the rest of you guys, thank you as always for watching. We've got 2 sets of Ahsokas coming up. That's going to be my next couple of builds. The Masterpiece and a Budget Ahsoka set. So stay tuned, and thank you.